Hello, everybody. This is the second podcast in the series entitled Who Rules Over Us? In the first podcast, we looked at how it was that our behaviors, our attitudes, our emotions, our beliefs, and even our thoughts are hugely influenced by three factors over which we have very little control. These factors overlap, and together they exert, at the very least, the most enormous influences on us. These factors are 1. Our biology, 2. The physical environment that we live in, and 3. The culture that envelops us. And with particular regard to the culture, it was pointed out in the first podcast that there is virtually no escape from it. From the very moment that we are born, our minds are invaded non-stop by the culture that surrounds us. The memes and the ideas that emanate from it pour into our minds constantly, and there is no escape from them. Even if you shut your eyes to block out the world, as you sit in your warm, soapy bathtub for a quiet period of reflection, your mind will still be bombarded by your culture. In other words, the notions and the ideas that pop into your mind as you are thinking will be conjured up by a biological structure, your brain, that has spent its entire life embedded in a culture. And you cannot escape from yourself. You cannot escape from your own brain, even when you are asleep. And from all this we can conclude two things. Firstly, we have very little in the way of genuine free will when it comes to our behaviors, our attitudes, our emotions, our beliefs, and our thoughts. And secondly, it can't be us who is running the show. We are not in charge of our lives. We seem to be more like actors on a stage, rather than like scriptwriters and directors. In other words, when it comes to the question of who rules over us, it doesn't appear to be us who is doing the ruling. So, who is? Well, I'll tell you. Running the show are these huge beasts. They are monsters that dwell amongst us. And they are everywhere. However, you cannot really see them or hear them. You can't shoot them or capture them, and it is almost impossible to describe them. But they're there. They are in front of you when you open your eyes, and they are talking to you when you are listening, even when you are listening to yourself. And there are hundreds of them. Now, before you press the stop button, having come to the inevitable conclusion that I am completely mad, I am going to identify some of these massive creatures for you. They are called superorganisms. Here are some of them. And as I list them for you, I want you to think about them as beasts, made up of many body parts that are similar to those that you would expect to find in living organisms. Intelligent, clever, resourceful organisms. Organisms that strive, just like us, to grow and to become stronger, and to compete for resources. And, like many other organisms, they have weapons. Are you ready? Here we go. And remember, try to see them as living organisms. We begin. Islam. Football. Government. Psychoanalysis. Russia, the country. Rupert Murdoch and his media empire. The Ford Motor Company. War. The oil industry. Fashion. Now, you might think that I'm pushing the boat out a bit too far by calling these things living organisms. But I think you would be wrong. They are living organisms, just like us. Only they are much tougher. They are much more resilient. And they are much more longer lasting than you or I will ever be. Indeed, they seem almost to be indestructible. That's how powerful they are. To prove my point about them being living creatures, here are the 7 main characteristics of life according to scientists. They use these characteristics to decide whether or not a system is alive. So, let's do the test. And I'm going to pick the organism of government as my example. The first characteristic of living things is that they are composed of cells. Well, the same is true of government. And, loosely speaking, its cells are the human beings that beaver away on its behalf. In the same way that your body's cells collude together to produce you, individual people collude together to create government. And just like biological cells do, these human beings beaver away on their organism's behalf. And, in much the same way that the cells that make up your body haven't got a clue about you, so it is that those people who work for government haven't really got a clue about this beast of which they are a part. Sure, they will know what is going on in their own necks of the woods, so to speak, more or less, perhaps in the office where they work. But they will not know very much about the huge monster that they serve, with its millions of workers, in different offices, in different departments, all doing their allotted tasks, right throughout the country. The police departments, the fire departments, the social services, the legal system, the tax system, the Department of Transport, the Department of Health, the educational bureaucracies all over the place, with their thousands of colleges and schools, and so on, and so on, and so on. It's all too big, too complex, too unknowable for the humble worker to know what is going on. And if you asked this humble worker, "What is government doing today about the incident in Oklahoma last night?" he wouldn't be able to tell you. At best, he would have a vague idea. And if you asked him, "What is government doing tomorrow?" he really wouldn't have a clue. How could he know what all those millions of workers were going to do tomorrow? Even the president wouldn't know. And if someone could communicate with the individual cells of your body, and, for example, they asked them, "Who is the person of whom you are a part?" they wouldn't know. And if you asked an individual cell from a person's brain, "What is your master going to have for dinner tonight?" it wouldn't know. It wouldn't understand the question. And even if it did understand the question, it would probably think, "What on earth are you talking about?" My point is this: people who make up organisms such as government are just as clueless about the organism, government, of which they are a part, as are your body's cells clueless about you. Your cells, even your brain cells, cannot see you. They cannot hear you. They cannot appreciate you. They cannot understand you or comprehend you. As individuals, your cells are just too small. They simply cannot handle the billions of details, in other words, the information, that describes you. Now, I don't want to labour this point too much, but the important bit is this: little things like cells can collude together to create organisms that are way beyond their own ability to comprehend them. And my contention is that the very same is true when it comes to little things like people, that's you, colluding together to create organisms like government. In other words, you do not understand the beast called government, and neither do I. And just like your cells cannot see you or comprehend you, I am saying that you cannot see or comprehend government. So, in a nutshell, government, just like any living organism, is indeed composed of cells, loosely speaking. And so, in my view, government passes the test for the first characteristic of life. The second characteristic of life is that living things have different levels of organization. For example, groups of cells collude together to form tissues, and these in turn collude together to form organs, which work together to create systems, such as the reproductive system and the respiratory system. And when it comes to government, something very similar happens. Groups of people collude together to form sections, the tissues, if you like. For example, police officers working on different types of cases, homicide, burglary, fraud. And these sections combine together to form departments, such as police departments, the organs. And different departments then work together to create systems, such as the justice system. So yes, government, just like living things, does indeed have different levels of organization. The third characteristic of living things is that they use energy. Well, government certainly uses energy. The fourth characteristic is that living things respond to their environment. Well, this is true for government. The fifth characteristic is that living things try to grow and they change size. Yes, government does this too. The sixth characteristic of living things is that they reproduce. Do governments reproduce? Well, yes, they do. They reproduce all over the world, throughout history. Big governments, small governments, local governments, national governments, tribal governments, international governments, and so on. The seventh characteristic of life is that living things adapt to their environment. And, of course, governments clearly do adapt to their environment. They evolve. In short, the organism of government is alive. It has got the 7 characteristics of life. And superorganisms such as this, nowadays, invade almost every corner of your life. Now, I want to read again the list of superorganisms that I gave you earlier. And I want you to think again about the items as being superorganisms with lives of their own, with thousands of little people working for them, with buildings and numerous other resources acquired by them, the whole enterprise being bound together within a framework or an ideology, having goals and strategies and purposes, just like biological organisms. And, just like biological organisms, they want to survive, to grow, and to become stronger. And this time, try also to imagine how they all reach out and somehow manage to affect all our lives. In other words, they influence all our lives. So, here we go. Islam. Well, of course, you might not be a Muslim, and so you think that Islam doesn't affect you. Oh yes, it does. It affects the whole world. Football. Ha, you say. Neither my missus nor I are affected by football, or by any other sport. In fact, we hate sports, and my children hate sports too. We never watch any sports, and we never take part in any of them. Indeed, there is no one whom we have ever known who has ever even mentioned sports. Come to think of it, we don't even know what sports are. No, sir, football does not affect us. Oh, yes, it does. For example, millions of youngsters actually believe that they are going to be successful professional sports players in the future. Here in the UK, mostly football players when it comes to the boys. And I can assure you that this significantly affects their attitudes to schoolwork, because they genuinely think that they don't need to study. You don't need to be good at maths to play football well, they will tell you. Look at David Beckham and Wayne Rooney. They're not very bright, or so they believe, rightly or wrongly. The upshot is that millions of these youngsters see little importance in education, and this will most certainly affect your life. In other words, football affects almost everyone in Western countries, in one way or another. Government. government clearly affects you. In the West, it invades your life from the boardroom to the bedroom. What else is there to be said? Psychoanalysis. What has the organism of psychoanalysis got to do with me? You say to yourself. I don't go to a therapist. I'm not affected by it. Oh yes, you are. Millions of people believe in its merits, and thousands of psychologists and psychiatrists believe in psychoanalytical theories, and their views about how people's minds function invade the media and the law courts all the time. As just one example, thousands of clinical psychologists in America still use the discredited Rorschach inkblot test, where people tell psychologists what various splodgy inkblots remind them of, in order to determine, for example, whether or not someone is fit to look after their own children. Because they believe, without much foundation I might add, that people's personalities can be judged on the basis of what they perceive those inkblots to be. And the recovered memory hocus-pocus has caused massive amounts of misery right across the Western world over the past many decades, with abuse hysteria dominating the media, and hence our minds, almost on a daily basis. So yes, the organism of psychoanalysis affects everyone in the country, because if large numbers of people are directly affected by it, then you are affected by it. Well, I think that I have made my point. In short, our lives and our brains are very much influenced by all sorts of strange creatures. So I will just read out the remaining members of my list, and you can work out for yourselves how they have impacted upon you, either directly or indirectly. Here they are. Russia. Rupert Murdoch and his media empire. The Ford Motor Company. War. The oil industry. Fashion. Now, I am sure that most of you will tend to think that these huge superorganisms are not really living at all. They are not alive. They merely appear to be like living organisms. And so I would like to address this doubt with two comments. Firstly, it would probably take me at least another 2 podcasts to try to convince you further that they are indeed living organisms. And I would probably need to focus on the facts that, essentially, they only differ from them in that they evolve and adapt extremely quickly compared to normal biological life, and in the number of units that make them up. For example, while a human being is made up of trillions of cells, even really big governments are typically served only by a few million people. And so, those who work on behalf of, say, government, are not quite as far removed from it as are human cells removed from the human beings that they create. But if it ever came to pass that government was composed of trillions of human beings, instead of just a few millions of them, you can surely get some idea of how much more unintelligible and lifelike it would seem to be. Secondly, whether or not you believe them to be alive, you can surely see that collectively it is these huge superorganisms who are running the show. We are not running them. They are running us. And you can test this quite easily. Just ask yourself this question. Do you have more influence over government than government has over you? No, you don't. When it comes to influence, which is what this podcast is really about, your influence on government is tiny and almost non-existent, whereas government has a huge influence on you. And the very same goes for all the other superorganisms that I have mentioned. And there are hundreds more that I could have mentioned. Collectively, their influence upon you is absolutely enormous. So enormous, in fact, that there is no room for yourself. Your influence box, your recommendations box, is filled to the brim with the voices of these superorganisms. And there is no room in it left for you. It's a bit like that film The Exorcist, where that girl's mind is taken over by various demons, or when you see the gullible minds of young college girls deranged by rabid feminism. And then, of course, the priest comes along, kills off the beast, and everyone seems back to normal again. But in real life, those superorganisms are not got rid of so easily. They are really hard to resist. And to give you a feel for just how influential I believe these superorganisms to be, my guess is that the average person underestimates the effects of them by at least a factor of 1,000. There really is almost no room left for you, if any. Goodness me, even the food that you eat is configured by their various efforts, and or scrutinized by their watchful eyes. There is almost no part of you that, collectively, they do not influence. Furthermore, and at the risk of depressing you further, in recent years, scientists have discovered to their horror that your body is, in fact, made up mostly of a large multitude of bacteria, viruses, and other microorganisms that populate every nook and cranny of your body. And current estimates suggest that only about 1/10 of your body is you. 1/10. And the more we learn, the smaller and the more insignificant do we appear to be. Certainly when measured against these superorganisms. But, if you can believe it, there is even worse news to be had, because these superorganisms are not human. They don't really care about humans. They only care about humans if they are of use to them. But maybe there is some good news too. In the same way that your body's cells can react to your poor treatment of them, by causing you discomfort and disease, which might cause you to change your heinous ways, so it is that human beings can respond to their own poor treatment by these superorganisms by causing them discomfort and disease. So, perhaps, we are not completely doomed. Yet. And I say yet because, to repeat myself, those organisms are not human. And, if it suits them, they will happily enslave us or kill us. Really, they will. In fact, they already do. As they have done so many, many, many times before. Massacre, mayhem, and misery spring to mind. The whole of history stands as a depressing testament to this. So, never kid yourselves into believing that just because humans create these superorganisms, that these monsters care about humans. And whenever they become too powerful, and they want something, history continually shows us that some of them will do whatever they can get away with in order to get it. And currently, some of these more malicious superorganisms are clearly becoming way, way, way too powerful. And, unsurprisingly, we don't seem to be able to stop them from doing so. But if we don't fight them, they will enslave us or kill us. They really will. Thankfully, however, we can, currently, fight even the most powerful and malicious of them. But there is only one way to do this. And in my next podcast, my dear friends, we will look at how and why these self-serving superorganisms grow, and we will see how they can be tamed. Thank you for listening.